Genesis, Creation and Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose. Part 5. Selections from the Letters of Father Seraphim. Editor's Note. For a background to these excerpts from Father Seraphim's letters, see the editor's preface as well as the editor's note on page 379. Section titles have been supplied by the editor. Names have been abbreviated in order to protect the privacy of living persons. 1. A Key in the Program of Anti-Christianity, to A.Y., August 16 and 29, 1972. As for evolution, which is a hoax and fraud if ever anything was, we have long wanted to have a good objective exposé, because of its devastating anti-Christian religious overtones and even found down, but have never had the chance to go into it ourselves. The statements of Father L., which you quoted on it, sound naive in the extreme. Over a year ago, Father N. mentioned he was going to print an article on the subject by Calamiros, but we assumed it would be entirely critical and expose the whole fraud of it. We know of no conceivable watering down or modification of the evolutionary hypothesis which would make it acceptable either to theology, philosophy, or science. Certainly the more sophisticated scientists today no longer take it seriously and recognize that it became popular solely by an act of faith and highly rigged evidence. Well, I think it's beyond us to start interfering with other fellow Orthodox publications and argue over what we think they should print, unless of course we have some facts or information they don't have, or unless they ask us to give our opinion. But surely we have the right to accept or reject what they do say, and even, if we feel it is necessary, to publish something that contradicts it, without of course publicly fighting with them. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. There's usually more noise than ever comes out of the grapevine into public view. We can't imagine that Father N. or Father P. would publish anything really pro-evolution, but even a vague middle-of-the-road article would be harmful enough, in view of the fact that evolution seems to be such a key in the whole program of anti-Christianity. 2. Theistic Evolution, to A.Y., January 31/February 13, 1973. The evolution article for the next issue looks very good to us, quite comprehensive and to the point. And also I don't think there's anything there to which Father P. and others could object. I'll tell you what gathered from them below. However, the article could be improved by expanding a little on several points. 1. At the bottom of page 1 you mention any form of evolution, and at the end of that paragraph you specify atheistic physical evolution, or theistic physical evolution, or spiritual evolution. However, your article is really addressed almost entirely against atheistic physical evolution and its absurdities, and some people might take advantage of this to say you haven't really considered more refined forms of theistic or spiritual evolution. In such a short article, of course, it's really not possible to go into them, but perhaps a sentence or two more on them will show why they can't be taken seriously either and are not at all more refined, just more vague and confused. Thus, theistic evolution, as I understand its motives, is the invention of men who, being afraid that physical evolution is really scientific, stick God in at various points of the evolutionary process in order not to be left out, in order to conform theology to the latest scientific discoveries. But this kind of artificial thinking is satisfactory only to the most vague and confused minds, for whom, apparently, God supplies the energy and order that can't be explained according to the second law of thermodynamics. It is satisfactory neither for theology nor for science, but just mixes the two realms up. Again, spiritual evolution applies the conclusions of atheistic physical evolution to the spiritual realm and comes to results which are monstrous and unacceptable either from the scientific or the theological point of view. A mix-up and confusion which can only disguise itself in fantastic jargon, a la Teilhard de Chardin. Both these kinds of evolution depend entirely on acceptance of physical evolution, and if that is shown to be unsound they fall. And in addition they are self-contradictory because the whole purpose and intent of the theory of physical evolution is to find an explanation of the world without God, i.e., physical evolution is by its nature atheistic, and it's only ridiculous when theologians run after the latest scientific theory in order not to be left behind by the times. I'm afraid I'm wasting too many words on this point, but you really should tell the reader a little more as to why other kinds of evolution are no more satisfactory. The central point, of course, is that evolution is not at all scientific, but rather a kind of science fiction theology, the product of faith, an atheistic faith, but nonetheless faith. That it is still so widely accepted surely shows how low not only theology, but just plain common sense thinking have fallen today. I still remember my freshman professor of zoology expatiating on the great ideas of man. For him, the greatest idea man ever invented was the idea of evolution, much greater, he believed, than the idea of God. 2. On Piltdown, Peking, Java Man, etc. on page 3. Isn't Piltdown the only one that is universally accepted as a fraud? If so, it would be wisest to emphasize it, citing the book on the subject, if you have the reference at hand, and mention the great doubts and questions surrounding the others, so as not to be accused of racing ahead of the evidence. 3. The second law of thermodynamics. You'd better give a brief definition at the beginning. See also the enclosed clipping, showing what brought a Soviet scientist to God. 4. You end with a reference to the gospel of foolishness, which might inadvertently lead some readers to think that, after all, you admit that evolution somehow makes sense and you have to be higher and more spiritual to see that it doesn't. No, on every level, from common sense on up, evolution is nonsense. Behold what real, unredeemed foolishness they fall into who try to do without God. The article, though short, is excellent, with a very good use of quotes from Darwin and others. Probably you will get lots of discussion on this. Perhaps one day you could put together a longer, more detailed article on evolution, with ample citations both from evolutionists, showing their naive faith and sloppy thinking, and their sound critics. I recall a good book I read some years ago by an ornithologist, Douglas Dewar, Difficulties of the Evolutionary Theory, to serve as a reference source for those who care to think seriously on the subject. In general, people are so afraid of challenging scientists on their own ground that they're afraid to get into this subject. A little clear thinking, such as your short article already reveals, can dispel a lot of this fear and the fog that surrounds the question. Father P. mentioned a little the question of evolution. I didn't mention your forthcoming article on the subject. Enough for me to see his basic attitude and fears, I think. His concern about fundamentalism seems to stem from a fear that the Orthodox battle against evolutionism might get bogged down on the same level as the supposed scientific arguments for it, and there thus might be endless arguments on fossil evidence, the precise meaning of the 6 days, etc. He is of course right that our Orthodox approach to the subject should not be on the scientific, but rather on the theological level. But I also gathered that he is not fully aware of the flimsiness of the scientific evidence in favor of evolutionism, which makes him perhaps overcautious and fearful on the whole subject. Yes, we should keep our basic approach high and theological, but we can also blow up that scientific evidence which just doesn't make sense, and which is really the result of blind prejudice and false theologizing in the guise of science. 3. A rival thought pattern to orthodoxy, to Father N., April 5th and 18th, 1973. The most important point regarding evolution. A. First of all, let us shock you right off by saying that we read the article before publication, made many suggestions, which were all incorporated into the article, and fully approved it, and now rereading it after receiving your letter, we find nothing seriously wrong with it, except that it is much too short and concise. Of course, now with your letter it becomes obvious also that the approach was perhaps too abrupt and direct for many Orthodox readers today, and more preparation of them should perhaps be made. B. Therefore, there is obviously some deep disagreement between your views and ours on this subject. I have always regarded evolution, in all its ramifications, as an important part of the American modern, intellectual baggage which I left behind when I became Orthodox, and it never before occurred to me that any aware Orthodox Christian would regard it as unimportant, especially now when many scientists have abandoned it, purely on scientific grounds. When the pseudo-religious presuppositions of its supporters are so evident, and when it is so much bound up with Masonry ecumenism and the whole pseudo-religious modern outlook, we were frankly astonished at your objection to the article, and have been thinking long and hard to try to find your thinking on this subject. Then it occurred to us, apparently you regard modern ideas as being of two types, those that directly attack the Church, which must be confronted and uprooted mercilessly, Masonry ecumenism, and those which do not directly attack the Church and are not directly theological, evolution. Is this true? Nonetheless, I don't see how it can be denied that modern ideas are after all one whole. They are formed first outside the Church, develop in atheist agnostic minds, and then move through the whole of society until they reach the Church, changing form in the meantime to fit in with each current of ideas. Evolution is one such idea, but it's not really an idea, see below, that has not yet directly attacked orthodoxy. But look what it has already done to Roman Catholicism. Is it not true that the whole dissolution of Roman Catholicism in the last decade is directly bound up with the unleashing of Teilhardism, whose books were more or less banned up to then? In that same period, a process which was presented for popular consumption 10 years ago in a rather cheap but symptomatic novel, The Shoes of the Fisherman? By this I do not mean that a certain number of Teilhardian theses were opposed to so many Roman Catholic theses and conquered them, for his evolution is not really a heresy. We will agree that this term applied to him, especially from the Orthodox side, is imprecise, but rather a whole rival thought pattern offering a whole different approach to life, and consequently religion. And being already so much a part of the spirit of the age, its approach was persuasive not by argument but by fitting in with unconscious attitudes of people who were outwardly Roman Catholic. We were rather surprised when you, and Father E., too, as I recall, mentioned that you haven't read Teilhard and weren't familiar with his ideas, i.e., you are waiting for the wave to hit orthodoxy before you start thinking of the subject. But really Teilhardism is the Christianity and orthodoxy of the future, or rather its metaphysical foundation. It fits very nicely in with charismatic phenomena, and it is by no means too early to find out what is hitting us. Here it may well be that a YS position, as a layman in the midst of the world, and coming from outside of orthodoxy, which has already been completely captured by evolutionary spirituality and philosophy, has enabled him to be aware of something that the more sheltered Orthodox, clergy, monks, lifelong Orthodox, simply don't see yet. How overjoyed I myself was to find this shelteredness when I became Orthodox, because I saw that in this world to itself, I would be able to change completely my mental orientation, not to mention spiritual, and no longer think at all in terms of the reigning despotism of ideas, in which evolution has a key place. I did notice, however, that other converts didn't seem to grasp this point, and some of them began to discuss how this or that modern current can be understood or accepted or criticized in terms of orthodoxy, a false outlook because there are two quite separate mental worlds involved, and the difference is rather greater than that between two totally unrelated languages. We fully agree with A.Y. that evolution is one of the most dangerous concepts that faces the Orthodox Christian today. Perhaps it is the very key intellectual to the assault upon the Church, to the very philosophy, and there is such a thing, of the coming Antichrist. If we understand you and Father E. aright, you regard it as merely an idea which one can take or leave, and which can involve one in endless modernist fundamentalist discussions which are totally pointless. How many hours in the first 7 days? Etc. We certainly agree on the pointlessness of such discussions, but now the issue is much deeper than that. Evolution is a whole mindset that is quite incompatible with orthodoxy. But that is a treatise in itself. A.Y.'s article, as I said, is much too brief, but perhaps it will have the good effect of inspiring a thorough treatment of the subject, not a modernist fundamentalist fight, but also not what Father E. apparently wants to do, to stand so far above the issue that one can't even discern that evolution is a crucial question, and destructive of orthodoxy, not so much because of its theses as because of its intellectual spiritual orientation. Significantly, the same mail that brought your letter brought also concern, with the article of Theodosius Dobzhansky, who just received a doctorate honoris causa from St. Vladimir's Seminary, on evolution, God's method of creation. Well, here are the arguments of an Orthodox evolutionist, and they are the same as all other evolutionary arguments, emotional faith with not one shred of genuine evidence to support it, although he presents material that jukes very formidable and scientific. But more important, read between the lines and answer, does this man believe in God as a true Orthodox Christian believes in him? He does not. He believes in him as modern man believes, he is a deist. And very revealing is his conclusion. One of the great thinkers of our age, Teilhard de Chardin, wrote the following: Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. This is what evolution is. This indeed is Teilhardism, and by all theories and systems, he means in particular theology and spirituality, as being part of the highest evolutionary layer, the noosphere, which is just now converging in the evolutionary apex called the Omega Point, or Super Christ. I hate to appear fundamentalist, but this mammoth structure rests on just a few little fundamental facts or fabrications, which most people seem afraid to get near because they seem so scientific, beginning with the transition of one species into another, and so up the ladder. To sum up, whatever weaknesses A.'s article on evolution may have, it is an attempt to answer a real problem which we cannot avoid, that ideological orientation and value system, which is taught in all public schools as fact, and which poisons and stupefies Orthodox minds without ever attacking orthodoxy as such. A.'s response is sound, even if it is not, of course, perfect. We Orthodox are not afraid to be narrow on the question of ecumenism. Why should we be afraid to be narrow on the question of evolution? The two issues, after all, are very closely bound up with each other. 4. A deep-seated primordial force to A.Y. April 5th and 18th, 1973. Just a note. We received Monday a rather shocking letter from Father N., expressing extreme displeasure with your evolution article. He apparently sent you a letter, too, a copy of which he said he was enclosing in his letter to us, but he didn't. After reading his letter, we read your article together once again, and neither of us find anything wrong with it, except that it is much too short and concise. After looking in vain for any other source of Friar N.'s displeasure, we can only conclude that Friar N. and Friar E. apparently are just not aware of the whole issue of evolution, whether in its scientific side or in its religious theological implications. Obviously your article has touched something very deep. Frankly, we are astonished that people so keen on ecclesiastical matters, ecumenism, etc., should seem never to have given much thought to such an important thing as evolution. Apparently it is because it seems to be outside the church sphere. We must be wise as serpents and gentle as doves in what we do and say now, and by no means must we allow ourselves to be dragged into an argument on modernist fundamentalist lines. Maybe they are modernists, I don't know, but we certainly are not fundamentalists. The truth lies much deeper than either of these merely rational positions, and it will not be easy to present it so that it will be properly understood, judging from Father N.'s first response. I don't think either you or we should argue at all, but prepare for a more thorough presentation of the whole subject. Frankly, we want to really persuade them, and the way to do that is to go into the subject deeply, especially the spiritual implications. What we must keep in mind and get across, I think, is not really evolution as a heresy or wrong idea, on the same level with other ideas, and therefore go out fighting with the ordinary weapons of polemics. Evolution is not that kind of idea, but rather a kind of deep-seated primordial force which seems to capture people quite apart from their conscious attitudes and reasoning. There's a good reason for that. It's been drilled into everyone from the cradle, and therefore is very hard to bring out and look at rationally. It's a rival thought pattern to orthodoxy, not just another idea. Your article, beyond any doubt, is going to make you unpopular in places. Do not let this discourage you or force you into a defensive posture. Your article is probably going to do something very painful at first, but ultimately positive. Bring out into the open some attitudes which have long been hiding in the shadows. 5. The argument against evolution is not scientific, but theological. To Father N., Palm Sunday, April 9th and 22nd, 1973. By the way, in case I didn't make it clear in my last letter, the argument against the supposed scientific theory of evolution is not itself scientific, for science itself can neither prove nor disprove it. For science it's only guesswork. The argument against it is theological, that it involves implications which are entirely unacceptable for orthodoxy, and these implications can't be escaped, and every propounder of evolution uses them, the theists and spiritualists being worse than the atheists. 6. The real intellectual problems of today, to A.Y., June 29/July 12, 1973. We received Father Yes' open letter today, together with your note. Yes, we found too that he completely missed the point, and all the very nice quotes from the fathers on the different degrees of knowledge mean nothing when one stops to realize that you are not at all attacking scientific knowledge, but only pseudo-scientific, pseudo-religious philosophy masquerading as science. And you are using scientific knowledge not to defend theology, but only to destroy the self-contradictory theories of the pseudoscientists. Are these points really so difficult to understand or impossible to defend? Unless we are crazy, Father E. has gone off somewhere in the clouds and is not at all in contact with what is going on in the world today, intellectually, which is very much of concern to Orthodox Christians who live in this world. Father E., in trying to stand so far above the whole question, does not give the impression that he speaks from the heights of the third degree of knowledge, which seems to be what he is trying to hint at, but rather uses this exalted knowledge for rather rationalistic purposes. We are very disappointed to see such narrowness. And the reply of the mother to the Orthodox high school youth, this apparently sums up his answer to the whole problem of evolution. How naive and spineless. Footnote: Father E. had written that, if an Orthodox youth comes home from school telling his mother that he learned that man evolved from a lower species, the mother's best reply would be, "My boy, God could have created us by any manner he wished, and no one will ever be able to explain or comprehend his ways. All we can do is thank him for creating us." Return to text. Can Father E. really be so unaware of the anti-Christian purposes of such scientific education? His reply is an open invitation to the youth to accept whatever the school teaches him, because we poor Orthodox Christians, alas, having such high knowledge, can't know any better. I'll tell you frankly, but don't quote me. This isn't theology, it's hogwash. There's a real and pressing problem here, and you've attacked it honestly, freshly, and well, considering the short space you had. If there are deficiencies or mistakes in what you've said, they can be talked about in a friendly manner. But alas, his only aim is to discredit you and put you in your place. This is wrong and sick. Forgive my strong language. After reading Father Yes' epistle, we begin to despair about the Greek wisdom of our own day, which seems to have all too much in common with the ancient variety. What will happen when they really begin to find out how simple and unconcerned about all those things that excite them we Russians are? One basic element seems lacking in all their wisdom, one which the Holy Fathers emphasize is essential for genuine Orthodox life: suffering. The wisdom born of leisure and idle disputes is not worth having, but the wisdom born of deep suffering, such as God has given above all to the Russians in our day, is alone truly balanced and sound, even if it cannot give a glib answer to every mocking question. Let us try to enter more deeply into this suffering, God giving us His grace to do soul. Any reply you make to Father E. should be brief and to the point. He has obviously taken unfair advantage of you in order thoroughly to discredit you, based on the reputation of the monastery as against you, a nobody. He is riding on a current of intellectual fashion, and this will pass, and it will not be for the good of the monastery that it has allowed itself to do this and not face the real intellectual problems of the day. It will not be easy to get the point of your longer study on evolution across to people who think like Father E. But with God's help it can be done. There is something deep and important here, a rather academic approach to theology that does not come to grips with the anti-theology of our day. 7. Such theology we do not need to A.Y. July 4th and 17th, 1973. Just a note. Father Yes' letter has sunk in a little deeper, and it makes us even more disturbed than at first. This is MOT an answer to anything, and is a disservice to English-speaking Orthodox Christians. Such theology we do not need. We thought of writing a note to him ourselves, but there is no point, since he already has read our letters to Father N., defending you and speaking of the need for all of us to get rid of our American modern intellectual baggage evolution, etc. Without entering into a public debate with him, we should by all means try to present sound Orthodox views on those points where he is obviously off the beam. Your evolution booklet will be very important from this point of view, and we are writing out a number of points which we hope to see treated or mentioned there, and also some suggestions on how to avoid being placed into certain stereotyped categories by which people can be persuaded not even to listen to what you say. Do you have a general outline of the article yet? We've written Dr. Calamiros a letter and hope to receive confirmation of our suspicion that he is quite wrongly used as virtually a proponent of evolution. 8. A product of the spirit of the times, to Father N., August 19/September 1st, 1973. Thank you for your new letter. On evolution, what can we say in reply? We will tell you just what we think. The article on exotastes, footnote, Greek for evolution, return to text, by no means is an objective Orthodox presentation on evolution. It is rather a simple-minded liberal presentation, in no way different from what any Protestant or Catholic magazine might publish, and is exactly what one would expect of the Greek Archdiocese, in harmony with its general liberal orientation. The article does not then raise the most serious questions which evolution poses, much less answer them. It is an absolutely typical product of the spirit of the times. Apparently you think rather differently. But Father, let there be peace among us. Evolution is an extremely complicated question, all aspects of it considered, and not one of us is in a position to know all about it and give a definitive judgment on all its aspects. Calling it a heresy, of course, is a great simplification, for it is much more complex than that, and it is evident that different people have quite different things in mind when they hear the word evolution, which complicates matters even more. This article was intended not for theologians but for simple people, and therefore its tone and presentation are admittedly somewhat simplistic and sharp. There are disadvantages to this, the first of which is that it obviously didn't say anything to you, and apparently others of a similar outlook. Obviously, for such people a much more thorough presentation should be made, and I think this would make it much easier for you to see how inadequate the Exotast's article is as we think. If you had read the grotesque, satanic theology of Teilhard de Chardin, you would certainly get a funny feeling from an article in which he is held up as an example of a reasonable approach to this question. 9. Looking forward with an open mind, to A.Y., September 8th and 21st, 1973. Yesterday we finally received a reply from Alexander Kalamiros to our letter inquiring as to his views on evolution, and he promises soon to send a detailed reply in English, with quotes from the Holy Fathers. We look forward to this with open mind and some expectation. 10. Quibbling over words, to A.Y., week of November 6, 1973. Concerning evolution, Father E. is quibbling over words, because he simply does not understand the whole question. He obviously misunderstands both Saint Nectarios, who certainly is not trying to make a scientific statement, but is only, quite properly, ridiculing the pseudoscientists who find man's origins in the ape kingdom, and Saint Basil, who is scientifically correct in his statement on pines and oaks, and he certainly did not intend to say that the seed of one produces the other, since the whole Hexameron emphasizes that each kind of creature reproduces only according to its kind. But it is futile to make an answer to these points. Rather, the whole discussion must be placed in a different, more serious context. Hopefully, this will be what your future article on evolution will do whenever God wills. 11. The Holy Fathers as the answer to medieval scholasticism, to A.Y., January 9th and 22nd, 1974. Interestingly, just before receiving your letter I was reading and thinking about Khomyakov's close friend Kirievsky, who thought very similarly, and is even better because of his close connection with Optina and the Holy Fathers. Kirievsky's thoughts on the difference between the Catholic Western mentality and orthodoxy might well serve as an article or pamphlet also, which would be very instructive especially for converts today. The answer to medieval scholasticism, he says, is the great Orthodox Fathers who lived at the same time, namely Saint Simeon the New Theologian, Saint Gregory the Sinite, Saint Gregory Palamas. And speaking of this contrast, my research into the Fathers concerning evolution has turned up something remarkable. The Catholic and Orthodox doctrines of Adam and creation are significantly different, and evolution can be fitted rather nicely precisely into the Catholic doctrine, but not at all into the Orthodox. This point can be made pretty well by comparing several passages of the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. I always wondered why I kept that book, with the passage from Saint Simeon which you have, and another from Saint Gregory the Sinite. The whole discussion of evolution, if it is presented just right, can be very important for giving our genuine Orthodox outlook on contemporary science and wisdom. I've also found commentaries on Genesis by Saint Ephraim the Syrian and Saint John Chrysostom, and some more isolated statements in other fathers. There can be no doubt at all how the fathers understood Genesis, quite literally. I was at first a little uncertain about a quote from Saint Gregory the theologian, showing that he regarded the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a symbol. And some fathers, such as Saint Gregory of Nyssa, are full of such symbols, leading a scholar like Florovsky to ask, does he understand the account of creation as entirely symbolic or not? And then, to resolve my uncertainty, leafing through a French translation we have of Saint Gregory Palamas, I found that, in opposing those who say that the uncreated light of Mt. Tabor is only a symbol, he cites the very passage from Saint Gregory the theologian about the tree of knowledge, and says that of course he also accepted it as having an existence of its own. All of these quotes put together should do much to give our Orthodox people the sound Orthodox approach to Genesis and creation, which I think many are now afraid of, due to the prestige of science. 12. Scientific Faith, to A.Y., January 24/February 6, 1974. Here are some more notes on evolution, specifically your chapters which we are returning herewith. Presumably your conclusion at the end of this chapter, on the popular science textbook Early Man, will not be, evolution is proved false and special creation true, but rather, evolution, presented popularly as fact and truth, has no coercive scientific evidence whatever to support it. All the supposed proofs of evolution can equally be used to prove another theory, depending on your presuppositions. Here you should set down in summary form all the major proofs of evolution, preferably quoting some major evolution textbook, or perhaps Encyclopedia Britannica. The 11th edition lists 8 evidences, showing that they presuppose a whole philosophy of nature, which is not at all derived from proofs, but from the intellectual climate of the age. See, for example, the enclosed booklet, page 67. Here you should also have some quotes from evolutionists themselves showing how they realize that there is no actual coercive proof of evolution, but that it makes more sense, or the alternative is unthinkable, i.e. God's creation, or other similar quotes. And when you thus quote evolutionists against themselves, as it were, you should be careful not to pounce on them and say, aha, they disprove themselves, but rather continue in a serene tone, not taking maximum advantage of their admissions, because you are going to let all their self-incriminating evidence speak for itself, until it piles up and at the end becomes absolutely self-evident, and then your own summation of this evidence will be very powerful. And then here is where you should give the intellectual context of evolution. It is too much for most readers to understand the whole movement of humanism, etc., besides which, they are still not disposed to think you are giving them the real story about it. It would be good to quote an authoritative, objective source at this point. So, enclosed find 5 pages of quotes from a good textbook on modern intellectual history. The author is himself modern and believes in evolution, and so does not have your prejudices. Yet he is quite precise and aware on the whole. These excerpts show accurately the change from the Newtonian mechanistic universe to the evolutionary universe of our times. Some quotes like these, perhaps with a few comments in between, may be all you need to establish the intellectual climate in which evolution developed. Now you are ready to enter the area of philosophy and theology, for the lack of strict scientific proof of evolution means that these questions basically are not scientific, but come from faith. At the same time you disengage yourself from the dead end of trying to disprove evolution. By science it can be neither proved nor disproved. It is a question of a different order than science. I don't know what or how much you plan to write on Orthodox evolutionists and Teilhard, but I think it might be possible to combine them in a single chapter called Christian Evolutionism. Rather in the same way that, in our charismatic article, we combine testimony from Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox charismatics, both because the testimony of all groups reinforce each other, and because there is really no difference between them. So also, Orthodox evolutionism is exactly the same as Catholic evolutionism. This also would give more punch to the section which I am compiling to follow the patristic quotes, and which might be called, effectively I hope, Latin scholasticism, the theological foundation of Christian evolutionism. In such a chapter on Christian evolutionism, a basic thing to show will be that adding God to evolution does not at all change its basic philosophical theological outlook and intent. God becomes a deus ex machina for saving evolution when the absurdity of believing in it without God, as a pure chance process, becomes too evident. Thus, quoting Dobzhansky and others, you can show how they believe in the same naturalistic universe, without God's interference, as do the atheistic evolutionists, the denial of God's providence, etc. As the climax to this section, Teilhard de Chardin, as extremely symptomatic of the spirit of the age, a religious thinker has come into fashion, favored even by Julian Huxley and the Soviet Union. P.I. send some material from Russia on Teilhard. You might look at Leconte du Nuy also, since the Greek Archdiocese article mentions him together with Teilhard de Chardin. An important part of this Christian evolutionism chapter, quote Teilhard de Chardin, the passage quoted by Dobzhansky at the end of his article, on evolution as absolutely universal. By this time the mere quoting of this passage will already show the reader how much such a view is dependent on simply absorbing the spirit of the times. This quote shows the blind faith of some religious figures in the latest current of scientific faith, and it offers an exact parallel to the blind faith of Alexander Pope in a different scientific faith, his adoration of Newton and his mechanical deist universe of perfect order, which was mocked a century later by Voltaire and Candide, a satire on the best of all possible worlds. The phrase is Leibniz's, but it sums up the faith of the whole 17th to early 18th century. Philosophical establishment. Pope's words will perhaps make your readers begin to see that one should not place so much faith in any scientific philosophy faith. Alexander Pope, Essay on Man. All are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul. All nature is but art, unknown to thee. All chance direction which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony not understood. All partial evil, universal good. And spite of pride, in erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. And in another place in Pope's works, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be. And all was light. Voltaire mocked this philosophy because it had become out of date. And thus your reader is warned, the suggestion is made. Maybe evolution, too, is such a passing faith that will become out of date one day, or is already becoming so. And this inevitably happens if Christian philosophy accepts the philosophy of the spirit of the age, which comes and goes. In general, it will be a good idea to contrast the Newtonian universe with the evolutionary. This contrast will give the reader probably all the intellectual context of evolution he needs, and in a very painless way, without forcing him to understand the whole history of modern thought. Many people simply aren't aware that there has ever been a science that wasn't evolutionary, and the contrast between Newton and evolution shows how one scientific theory gives way to the next. Thus you will undermine the scientific faith of your readers. In our theological section, we will also be quoting Saint Basil the Great and Father Michael Pomazinski on this subject. The climax of the whole article will then be in presenting the Orthodox theology of creation, Adam, which is totally independent of all scientific fashions. For orthodoxy does not follow the philosophy of the age, because it has its own philosophy based on revelation. The Holy Fathers have a complete theology of the origin of man and creation, which is not bound up with any intellectual fashion that passes away. This doctrine is not modified with every passing philosophy, is not bound up with either the static universe of perfect harmony of Newton, which departed from orthodoxy by making the universe purely naturalistic, and evolution is actually just the present philosophy of the naturalized universe divorced from God and his action, nor with the developing universe of Teilhard de Chardin and other fashionable thinkers today. Our philosophy is not of this world, and it is the answer to the vain speculations of modern man. Above all, the whole study should be as simple and as much to the point and as objective as possible. If one accepts the principle of objectivity and believes in the Holy Fathers, then the whole study, even in a very low key, should gradually build itself up to a devastating and convincing conclusion. By the way, in your scientific chapters, one hope you have a good account of the carbon dating system and whatever evidence there is for millions of years. Also, you must be prepared for answers in several points of the history of mankind. How do you explain Neanderthal man, for example? We've received Father N.'s newest comments on evolution, where he tries to identify anti-evolutionism with the sectarian fringe. Why such pointless comments? One senses that he somehow feels unsafe on evolution, is somehow threatened by anti-evolutionism. Actually, he only confuses more those people who are already uncertain enough what to believe about evolution. And then yesterday we received from the Zion Orthodox Hermitage a copy of the letter to Father N, which you had already showed us, together with an article which we hadn't seen, called The Creation Narrative. Seeing the quote from St. Hippolytus on page 1, we looked forward to some patristic documentation. But alas, the author doesn't come through with this, and he turns out to be quite vague on the whole subject himself. In the next last paragraph of page 2, he quite loses himself in wild speculations, which are not only unscriptural, I've never heard of anyone who threw dinosaurs in before the 6 days of creation, but are also doctrinally unsound. The suggestion that there could have been evil in the visible creation before Adam's transgression. That asterisk in a word, the author is quite naive, and in his fear that science might be right about the millions of years, he already has quite a lot in common with many present-day evolutionists. 13. At last the real battle begins. To A.Y. February 25/March 10th, 1974. We received yesterday the long-awaited epistle of Dr. Calamiros on evolution. 40 pages long. I must confess that it is shocking beyond our expectations, giving the evolutionary teaching quite unadorned and unqualified, complete with the evolved beast Adam, and he who denies evolution denies the sacred scriptures. In a way, however, we are rather glad of this, because now for the first time we have found a reputable Orthodox evolutionist who is willing to be quite frank about matters which others, I believe, are afraid to speak up about for fear of offending weak consciences which are under Western influences. I have written him a short letter saying I wish to make a long and detailed reply to him and to start a dialogue with him on this subject. I believe that if we can answer him point by point and raise the points he doesn't mention, we can make the forthcoming publication a very powerful one. I must confess to being rather disappointed in the tone of his letter, which is somewhat in the elevated tone of Father E., with repeated comments about Western rationalists, etc. However, he ends very nicely and begs us to tell him where he is wrong, so we must do this. Frankly, I would like to convert him completely, but God only knows what is possible and how much his mind is still open. The most encouraging thing is that he, like us, regards the matter as extremely important, as opposed to those who think it's unimportant and that everyone can believe as he wishes. With Dr. Calamiros, at last the real battle begins. You can read the letter on your next visit. I'm beginning now on my reply to it. But in general, this is my feeling about it. Father Herman hasn't read it yet. 1. Patristically it is very weak. Very few fathers are quoted, and the only really evolutionary quote is a passage from St. Gregory of Nyssa, a passage which I noted a few weeks ago, by the way, and thought at the time, I'd better use this and explain it, because one who already believes in evolution will be sure to think it proves evolution. It does not, of course. It is merely a general statement of the orderly progression of God's creation from the lowest to the highest, with the most perfect creature, man, coming last. Nothing is said about man or any creature evolving, and in another part of the same book, on the making of man, St. Gregory says explicitly that Adam was ungenerated, but was created directly by Christ. 2. There is a long theological discourse on man's nature, which is very partial and one-sided, but will require a solid answer with quotes from Holy Fathers. For evolution above all involves a false anthropology, doctrine of man. 3. It is quite obvious that Calamiros has gone to the Fathers already knowing that evolution is a fact. He obviously has not given deep thought to examining the presuppositions of the fact of evolution, so we will have to challenge him to start thinking, and not bring to the Holy Fathers his preconceptions based on modern Western wisdom. 4. He is very imprecise on the very meaning of the word evolution. He thinks the development from embryo to mature man is evolution, and that the existence of different races of men is due to evolution. Very naive. 5. The man is not a theologian, but reads the Fathers by hit and run. 14. Love for the Holy Fathers. To Dr. Alexander Calamiros, February 25th, Second Sunday of Great Lent, 1974. We have received your letter concerning evolution, for which we thank you very much. I have read it, trying, as you said, to remove all Western conceptions from my mind. I hope, if God gives me the strength, to study your points carefully and write you a very long and detailed reply before too long, but for the present I wish to say only a few things. I myself have been searching the Holy Fathers for some time, seeking to find out their teaching on the questions which are raised by evolution. I have been compiling a great many passages from their writings, including most of the passages which you quote in your letter. I have tried very hard not to project into these passages any preconceived opinions of my own, but I must acknowledge that my conclusions regarding the teaching of the Holy Fathers are quite different from yours. I believe that I can show you that some of your interpretations of the Holy Fathers are incomplete, that is, that you have presented only a part of their teaching and have overlooked other parts that are quite essential to the question. I would also like to present to you patristic texts on questions which you do not raise in your letter, but which I believe are also quite essential for understanding the questions raised by evolution. I note also in your letter that your use of the term evolution is somewhat imprecise, and I would like to discuss this question also in some detail. I agree with you that this subject is vital and extremely important. We have found very few people who are willing or able to think clearly on this subject, with the result that there is much confusion in the minds of Orthodox faithful concerning it. We are therefore very grateful to you for writing your views so clearly and outspokenly. Like you, we also do not want to have merely our own opinion on this subject, but only wish to accept the teaching of the Holy Fathers. So far we have not found any evolutionist or anti-evolutionist who sets forth the real Orthodox teaching on this subject, and that is why we ourselves have been making research on it. The Protestant fundamentalist objections to evolution are mostly superficial and rationalistic, as you yourself have noted, being based on an interpretation of the book of Genesis that comes from common sense and not from the Holy Fathers. We are not theologians, and I will tell you frankly that we distrust people who call themselves theologians, for almost all of them seem to us to be just academic rationalists. But we dearly slash over the Holy Fathers and wish to live by their teaching, and we sense that you do also. May it be that by this love, with the help of God and by the prayers of these Holy Fathers, we may now begin a dialogue with you that will bring us all to the true patristic teaching and be of help also to others. Everything that I write will be read and criticized by my co-laborer Father Herman, to whom I am in obedience, and we will try also to obtain the opinions of some of our Russian theologians whom we respect. 15. The Power of This World and Its Fashionable Ideas to A.Y. March 2nd and 15th, 1974. I have almost finished my reply to Dr. Calamiros, and I think God has helped me to put all the patristic material, or almost all, I have been collecting into a coherent presentation, and much more effectively than if I had gone ahead with the sober and objective presentation I had planned on. One of the Egyptian elders once said to St. John Cassian, roughly, "I'm glad you expressed this question so stupidly, because now I can clearly set forth the true doctrine." Calamiros has expressed stupid evolutionism so well, which other Greeks are afraid to do openly, that the reply to him almost writes itself. Although I know the Fathers only poorly, still their doctrine touching on evolution is so clear once one puts it all together, that I am simply amazed at the power evolution has over even educated Orthodox minds. Such is the power of this world and its fashionable ideas. I will send you a copy of my letter and Calamiro's letter also when I finish typing it. It is almost twice as long as Calamiro's letter to us, and will probably be 40 printed pages. Of course, now that I've done this, I don't quite know what relation this letter has to our projected book, which is absolutely necessary to get out. It may be that the book might be most effective precisely in this letter form, only somewhat revised and divided up into chapters, and with all your scientific and philosophical material entered at the appropriate places. You will notice that I mention this material at various points of the letter without going into it, as the letter is almost entirely patristic. Anyway, see what you think once you read the letter, and we will also see what Calamiros replies. Of course, many people will be upset that the evolution question is raised again and not kept quiet, but we agree with Calamiros that it should be raised and the true patristic teaching set forth. There is something very unsound about wishing to keep quiet about a question which remains so confused in most Orthodox minds. Pray for us. Today I hope to finish the last and most important section of the letter to Calamiros concerning the nature of man, on which Calamiros has expressed something perilously close to Augustinianism, based on a very wrong interpretation of the words of Saint Seraphim of Serav. 16. Unknowingly harboring modern ideas, to A.Y. March 9th and 22nd, 1974. The objective scientific approach is very necessary, not enough to get bogged down in scientific proofs, but just enough to show that the scientific proofs cancel each other out, as it were, leaving the question of evolution in its real sphere of philosophy and theology. The weakness of evolution as science and philosophy will only serve to emphasize the importance of the patristic view, which is so definite and really powerful. By the way, I begin to see that I myself have been harboring some modern ideas on the 6 days of creation. It's true that this is not the most important question involved with evolution, but it's not really a matter of indifference either. There is a profound patristic teaching in this, as I indicate in my letter to Calamiros. But it would be good to have further patristic testimony on this, so please say if you know of any. We will continue to collect patristic material for the final version of the book. 17. Genuine Science, to A.Y. St. Thomas Tuesday, April 10th, 1974. For my own background, I checked out 2 books in the Reading Library, Raymond Dart's Jan's Search of the Missing Link, which looks to be too popular to be of much use, and Louis Leakey's Adam's Ancestors, to which I find myself, after a few chapters, rather sympathetic, inasmuch as it seems to be rather careful and precise scientifically. Of course, iPhone discounts the attempt to fit all the evidence into an evolutionary framework, which does indeed seem to be a philosophical intrusion. I've come across several references to the fluorine dating system, but no thorough discussion of it. Leakey mentions it as being in its infancy in the 1940s. It has to do apparently with the rate of absorption of fluorine, which seems to be vastly variant depending on moisture, etc. It would be good for us to give a kind of philosophy of the dating systems, i.e., showing that we do not reject them outright, but that their significance is relative and limited, somewhat helpful in the genuine study of paleontology, which we should also emphasize as a legitimate science, but not any absolute answer to anything. In general, we should communicate a very friendly feeling toward genuine science. 18. Clearing up confusion, to A.Y., August 2nd and 15th, 1974. I will be working on the final, patristic section this fall, and God willing the whole study will be complete by the time Calamiros sends his promised reply, which should give us all the patristic arguments of the supporters of evolution, making our study as complete as possible. I think the impact of this study will be considerable. I do not think most conscious Orthodox Christians are terribly prejudiced in favor of evolution, but they are somewhat confused as to what or how much to believe of what science says. Our study is supposed to give the complete picture, which hopefully will clarify many minds. It certainly clarified my own mind, since previously I hadn't thought in detail on many aspects of the question. 19. The Genealogies of Christ, to A.Y., September 22/October 5th, 1974. We received the 2 sections on evolution. Christian evolution, I read over hastily, and it looks good. Probably we can leave any final revisions until the whole article is ready for final form. The scientific part, however, Father Herman and I read together and found problems. Basically, everything we want to say is there, and the tone is good. It's even a little too understated at times. But the meaning doesn't come through simple and clear, there being so many side questions, or rather, the side questions are not yet welded into the whole, so as to leave one single, convincing impression that evolution is philosophy and science has nothing to do with it, with a strong hint, which comes from just presenting the evidence itself, that the scientific evidence, if anything, is against evolution. Therefore, I will try to rethink and re-outline and rearrange the material and see if the meaning can be made somehow more transparent. As for the final patristic section, I am still compiling citations and making notes, hoping to get as broad an attack as possible on the question. I seem to recall that in Father P's tape he mentions the fact that the Savior's genealogy back to Adam might contain some symbolical names, i.e., that there might be whole gaps of hundreds or thousands of years. That's an important point. There is no doubt that the Holy Fathers regarded these names precisely as a list of fathers, but since no one ever doubted this before, they don't have many explicit statements on the subject. Incidentally, the Fathers were very concerned to reconcile the genealogy in Luke with that of Matthew, and the answer of St. Gregory the theologian and other fathers is that the few differences in the 2 stem from the practice of the younger brother taking the older brother's wife to raise up offspring for him, if he was childless, and one genealogy calls the father the one who was the real father, and the other takes the one for whom he was a father, so to speak. You might look in the scriptural index of any fathers you have, and see if anyone comments on Luke 3 verse 24. Footnote. In his notes, Father Seraphim translated a passage by the 11th century biblical commentator Blessed Theophylactus of Bulgaria concerning why St. Luke the Evangelist carried the genealogy of Christ all the way back to Adam. The nativity of the Lord, as being without seed, encountered mistrust. Therefore the Evangelist, desiring to show that at another time also a man was produced without seed, ascends from the lower descendants up to Adam and God. As it were, he speaks thus: if you do not believe that the second Adam, Christ, was born without seed, then I beg you to turn in mind to the first Adam, and you will find that he was created by God without seed, and after this you will not be unbelieving. Quoted in the commentary on the Gospel of Luke by Bishop Michael, Kiev, 1899, page 308. After Father Seraphim's repose, a commentary on the Gospel of St. Luke by St. Ambrose of Milan came out in English translation. It contains an extensive discussion of the genealogy of Christ back to Adam. St. Ambrose of Milan, Exposition of the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, 1998, pages 81 to 111. Return to text. 20. The Larger Idea of Naturalism, to A.Y., February 14th and 27th, 1976. I myself would say that our basic framework of making references to popular and high school texts on evolution is the right one, for that is how it is taught and understood, and where the evolutionary philosophy comes through loud and clear. But it would be good to strengthen our position with more reference to sophisticated scientific sources, to show we are aware that scientists don't believe everything they give the high school student, and even realize that much there comes from faith, but still have the basic evolutionary faith that the universe explains itself and can be understood in natural terms. I don't recall if we have made it clear anywhere yet that our argument is only secondarily against the particular theory of evolution and primarily against the larger idea of naturalism, that the universe explains itself. 21. Scientists who question evolution, to Dr. Alexander Calamiros, February 22/March 6, 1976. We received your new letter on evolution. Now I do not know if it is possible to continue this discussion or not. You have placed me in a category. I am a fundamentalist, a literalist. I am against science and under Western influence. I am afraid that anything I may now say, you will dismiss as of no value. If so, there is no point in my even replying to your letter. Your mind is already made up about me, and you will not listen to whatever I may say. I hope that this is not so, because you are the first Orthodox evolutionist I have found who is willing to discuss this question at all, and I think both of us could gain greatly by continuing this discussion. But I will have to tell you clearly that, despite your impression, I am not a fundamentalist, nor am I against science. Quite the contrary. But you are placing an impossible limitation to this discussion when you say, I would discuss evolution with you from the scientific point of view only if you had some diploma of one of the biological or geological branches of natural science. Since you wish it to be so, I of course can say nothing. But let me quote one of your scientific statements. The stages of the embryo in the uterus are exactly the stages of life's evolution upon Earth. This is so exact that even the gills of our ancient ancestors, the fishes, exist in the fetus of even the most perfected animals of the solid Earth, the mammals. And now let me quote two statements made in scientific journals and textbooks by scientists possessing advanced degrees in their specialties. 1. Haeckel's recapitulation theory, which is exactly what you have described to me as an unquestioned scientific fact, has been demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars. Walter J. Bach, biologist of Columbia University, New York, in the article Evolution by Orderly Law, in Science, Volume 164, May 4, 1969, page 684. 2. The type of analogical thinking that leads to theories that development is based on the recapitulation of ancestral stages, or the like, no longer seems at all convincing, or even very interesting to biologists. Professor C. H. Waddington, University of Edinburgh, in Principles of Embryology, 1965, page 10. I do not bring these examples in order to debate this theory with you. I do so only in order to show you that something which you accept as undisputed scientific fact is not only disputed, but even denied by reputable scientists, many of whom are themselves evolutionists. The same is true of some other scientific facts which you cite, and which you refuse to allow me to discuss with you. Despite your accusation, J. am not against science. Do not have an advanced degree in science, but I have taken college courses in zoology and done considerable reading in scientific sources on the theory and facts of evolution. I have read the Life book on evolution and found it very disappointing, because I hoped to find in it demonstrations of facts, because I am sincerely interested to know whether evolution is true or not, and instead I found only diagrams and pictures and descriptions which are not convincing to anyone with an open mind, but only to someone who already believes in evolution on other grounds. Your mind is evidently closed on this subject, and you seem to be unaware of the great mass of scientific literature in recent years which is highly critical of the evolutionary theory, which talks about relegating it to poetry and metaphors instead of scientific theory. Professor Constance, professor of botany at the University of California, Berkeley, or even deny its validity altogether. If you wish, but it is quite pointless. I could indeed compile a list of hundreds, if not thousands, of reputable scientists who now either disbelieve in evolution entirely or state that it is highly questionable as a scientific theory. Many of them state quite openly, evidently Greece is still behind the West in this regard, that a literal creation in 6 24-hour days is one possible interpretation of the scientific facts which we now have. Although you will recall that I wrote in my first letter that this question is not one of the first importance, in my opinion. There is also now much scientific evidence that the world is no older than 8,000 to 10,000 years. I do not say that this is scientifically proved. I say only what scientists themselves now say, that there are some undisputed scientific facts which make sense only if the world is very young. Are you going to tell me that I am crazy or against science, when I can quote doctors of geological and biological sciences, many of whom are not fundamentalists, who say things like this. If so, then there is no point discussing the issue further, because that would mean that you yourself are against science, are against an impartial and objective examination of scientific facts. I pray that this is not so, for then your views on evolution would be worthless, being only the creation of your own imagination. I do not wish to discuss in detail with you any of the scientific evidence for or against evolution. There are others who can do this much better than I. I only ask, to begin with, that you allow me to send you one book, written by a scientific specialist, in geology I believe, who has given his views at lectures to geological societies here in America, that contains, in a rather balanced discussion, criticisms of the many weak points of the evolutionary theory. I do not agree with everything written there. It is on a somewhat popular college-age level, but it does give us a beginning for possible further discussion. Religion is not mentioned in this book, which discusses only scientific evidence. If you are willing to read this book, or at least some chapters of it which interest you, with a reasonably open scientific mind, then it will be possible to continue our discussion. 22. Avoiding One-Sidedness, to A. Y. March 17th and 30th, 1976. I haven't gone back to Calamiro's letter, and probably won't attempt a reply before summer. The letter, although I find its tone distasteful, is helpful, because it shows the reaction that our evolution book would have had in some quarters if it hadn't first been tested by this correspondence. This will help us to avoid one-sidedness. I have the impression Calamiros demonstrates quite a bit of rationalism himself. He writes not as from within a tradition himself, but as one who is striving to get into the tradition. Our uninterrupted Russian tradition, for all its real and supposed Westernisms, has a strength and resiliency which the rediscoverers of tradition do not have. May God help us to express these things in a way that can be accepted and assimilated today. 23. 3 Axioms to Father I, July 3rd and 16th, 1977. About evolution. We were glad to have your comments. If you really want to see them so much, and Dr. Calamiros has already distributed his letters, we could send you copies, after we've made our reply to his second letter. But really, this correspondence has not been very fruitful at all. At first we were encouraged by the fact that he was willing to discuss the matter at all, which few Orthodox seem to want to do, and we responded to him in a tone that we thought was roughly the same as his own, not fearing to be corrected on any mistakes we might make, but hoping that, although starting almost poles apart, we might in the end work out this question in friendly debate and come rather close together by the end of it. But we see now that our reply seems only to have offended him. Perhaps most of all he disliked our strong implication that he is probably just as much under Western influence as the rest of us poor mortals, and his second letter offers almost no chance for an extension of the debate. Our reply will probably be short, whenever we get a chance even for that, and we'll have to begin by pointing out some of the contradictions he has fallen into himself, with little hope of even getting him interested in some of the more basic questions which, as I recall, haven't even been mentioned yet by either of us. But for now, leaping at the chance to chew this question a little more, I will only give you a few of my own observations, not on evolution itself, but on the approach to it, which seems so difficult but is so essential. First of all, we were very disappointed in all the 3B letters on the subject which we have seen. There is very little there that we would disagree with, save for the flippant tone in some places, but they never really get to the question of evolution at all, and they are certainly not the orthodox answer or approach to the question which Father E. had promised to give. In fact, these letters reveal a distinct attempt not to approach the question at all, but rather to stay above it, with a rather superior air. Symptomatic is Father Yes' confession, either there or elsewhere, that he has never read Teilhard de Chardin and doesn't need to, as also his evident ignorance of the whole scientific side of the question. The funny cartoon he included has nothing to do with any new findings, for example, but was old news 80 years ago. Likewise with Dr. Calamiros, he prides himself on knowing nothing at all of Western teachings on evolution, apart from what he regards as scientific facts, and insists that we pay attention only to what he teaches on the subject, which is patristic. 1. This brings us to axiom number 1 in our approach to the question, not the most important one, but first in order of discussion, the question of evolution can't be discussed at all if one doesn't have a basic grasp of the scientific side of it, the scientific proofs of evolution, as well as the broader philosophy of evolution based on it, Teilhard de Chardin, etc. This is precisely what the Fathers seem to be afraid of, and in general our Orthodox theologians also, including Father Michael Pomazansky, if I'm not mistaken. Once you get into science, the theologian is out of his depth, there are endless fruitless debates, etc. I think this is why Dr. Calamiro's evolution articles in the Greek religious press stirred up uneasiness, but no distinct protests, because theologians in general just don't know how to handle the scientific side. By this I don't mean that one has to be a scientific specialist in order to discuss the scientific side of the question. The scientific side is not the most important one, and specialists usually trip themselves up by concentrating too much on it. But if one isn't sufficiently aware of the scientific side, one won't be able to grasp the question in its full scope. One can't say with assurance, for example, whether man has been on Earth some 7,000 or 8,000 years, more or less, as the fathers often say, if one is totally ignorant of the principles of radiometric dating, geologic strata, etc., which prove that man is millions of years old. And such knowledge is not esoteric at all. The basic principles of radiometric dating, enough to show its strong and weak points, can be explained in a rather short article. And the question of whether man has been on Earth for some thousands of years or some millions of years is one that certainly touches on some basic Orthodox questions. Whether the genealogies of the Scripture are actually genealogies, as all the fathers certainly believed, or just sketchy lists with many long blanks in them. Whether some of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, if these are not genealogies, might not be symbols instead of concrete people, whether Adam himself ever existed. Especially in view of what seems the prevailing theory now among evolutionists, polygenism, that new species begin in many pairs simultaneously, etc. This is just a sample to show that to get anywhere in this question, one must have a basic, layman's awareness of the scientific evidences for and against evolution. If one is reasonably objective and not out to prove one's point at any cost, such questions need not arouse passionate debates. As a basic principle, of course, we must assume that scientific truth, as opposed to various opinions and prejudices, cannot contradict revealed truth, if only we understand them both correctly. Your point, to start with basic theological principles, I think is good, and these should always be fundamental. And one must always be well aware of the different modes of knowledge and not mix them up. The trouble is, the question of evolution is so complex that one isn't always aware which aspect of it has ceased to be scientific and has intruded on theology or philosophy, or exactly where the real conflicts arise. There, I think it is very important, as a second axiom. 2. To be aware of the basic philosophies underlying or derived from evolutionism and various other views of origins. The evolutionary philosophy of up from the beasts certainly seems irreconcilable with the Christian view of fall from paradise, and our whole view of history will certainly be determined by which way we believe. The Catholics used to solve this problem with a deus ex machina. When the body had evolved sufficiently, God specially created a soul for it. Their evolution is correct, and so is Genesis broadly interpreted. Calamiro's has basically the same view, though he has a more patristic vocabulary to describe it. But such views are very artificial and contrived. The Christians wait for the latest evolutionary hypothesis and twist the text of Genesis to fit in with it. This won't do. An awareness of how evolutionary philosophers, such as Teilhard de Chardin, view the whole question of evolution, while it may not solve any specific question, will still give a broader view of the whole intellectual background behind evolution. 3. Axiom 3. The whole question of Genesis cannot be well approached by Orthodox people without appealing to the basic Orthodox sources, the Holy Fathers. Especially valuable, the Hexaemera of St. Basil and St. Ambrose, commentaries on Genesis by St. John Chrysostom and St. Ephraim the Syrian, homilies on Adam, paradise, and the first created world by St. Simeon the New Theologian, especially homily 45 in the Theophan the Recluse edition of 1892, St. Gregory the Sinoite in the Russian Philokalia, St. Abba Dorotheus, Instruction I, commentaries of various fathers on related passages of Scripture, for example, Romans 8 verses 19 to 22 concerning the vanity or corruption of the post-Adamic world, or St. Gregory the Theologian on the genealogies of Christ, homilies on the subject of the resurrection, or whenever the question of seed or growth is discussed, treatises on the origin of man, St. Gregory of Nyssa, patristic discussions on reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls, which are philosophically related to the question of evolution, etc. About Dr. Calamiro's, Our second reply to him will point out where we think he went astray in his patristic interpretations. But our general impression of his 2 letters, which we won't write him directly for fear of offending him again, is this. 1. He is very unprepared to discuss the question either scientifically or philosophically. He is unaware of Western discussions of the subject and is only concerned to stand superior to them, which one can't do if one isn't aware of them. It is abundantly obvious from his 2 letters that he, and probably Greek scientists in general, is fat behind the West, and he is holding to scientific and philosophical positions long abandoned or in process of revision by Western scientists themselves. As one example, his defense of Haeckel's recapitulation theory of the human embryo. Today's evolutionary textbooks of embryology dismiss it as a 19th century fantasy, but Calamiros not only clings to it as an obvious proof of evolution, but even forbids us to discuss any scientific questions with him until we get advanced degrees in the physical sciences, a typical refuge of someone who doesn't want a free discussion of the subject. He is not aware, either, of the less dogmatic spirit which many evolutionary scientists now have, nor of the immense number of scientists with advanced degrees who now have abandoned evolution entirely or are skeptical of it. 2. He is theologically unprepared for such a discussion, something which surprised us most of all. Even after promising us that he was going to reply only after reading all the basic patristic texts on the subject, he still bases his whole argument on 2 or 3 patristic texts, very one-sidedly interpreted, and does not even answer a number of our patristic citations, which are only a small part of the patristic passages we have found. His St. Gregory of Nyssa quote says nothing whatever of evolution unless you read it into the passage, and the St. Seraphim quote certainly does not sustain his interpretation, wherein he does precisely what he accused us of doing, taking chronologically words which are ontological in reference. When I say that Dr. Calamiros is unprepared, I do not of course mean that he is incapable of discussing the question, merely that he is so prejudiced in advance, with a complex about being inferior to Western wisdom, that he does not view the question at all objectively. I quoted St. Ephraim's very fundamentalistic view that the 6 days were 24 hours long, without precisely agreeing with him, and Dr. Calamiros dismissed it by saying he was using the science of his time. But since the science of St. Ephraim's time most certainly did not teach that the world was created in 6 24-hour days, with 12 hours between each creative moment, I can only assume that Dr. Calamiros is not prepared to examine patristic evidence very objectively, using any excuse to dismiss whatever doesn't agree with his own views. I would strongly suspect that Father Michael Pomazinski would prefer not to make any general comments on the question of evolution. However, if you gave him specific questions touching on theology, you might get answers. But then again, he might be so afraid of the scientific side that he might hesitate even here. This letter is already too long. Unfortunately, I just won't have time for some while to set down the patristic quotes I have found up to now. But sometime perhaps I will get the time. You might be interested in some of the publications of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, especially books like Scientific Creationism, Public School, i.e., non-religious edition, which present only scientific evidence without reference to religion. Their presentation of the creation model is a promising approach to a more objective view of the whole question. Their religious views, of course, suffer from the general short-sightedness of fundamentalism, in particular, their unawareness of the whole patristic field of commentary on Genesis, but most Orthodox people have a similar lack of awareness. I'm enclosing 2 of their pamphlets, with their address, so you can order some of their books if you want. I would like to keep up this discussion, a little at a time, if you wish to. 24. Notes from a Dialogue on Evolution to Father I, August 8th and 21st, 1977. A few notes on our continuing dialogues on evolution. Many thanks for your 2 letters. 1. The question of the age of the earth is a question raised by science, which cannot give it a completely satisfactory answer, and touching on revelation and certain theological questions. From the point of view of biblical interpretation, this question is dependent on a more fundamental one: the age of mankind. Here the text of Genesis does not need to fear the evidence of science, and since modern science does talk about this, we have to have an intelligent answer to the opinion concerning the millions of years during which, supposedly, not merely galaxies have existed, but even man himself and his near ancestors have been walking on Earth. One cannot escape the question of the existence of man in chronological time, since both Genesis with its patristic interpreters and science seem to be talking about the same kind of years we know, by reference to the formation of galaxies and the relativity of time. The primordial galaxies themselves are a product of the scientific speculations of modern thinkers, and neither more nor less deserving of credence than ancient Greek speculations concerning the origin of the world. 2. This raises another fundamental question. How much should we use science in a commentary on Genesis? I would say, as a very minimum, we must know enough about science and its modern speculations to have an answer to those who use it to disprove Genesis. Thus its chief function today is perhaps negative. But beyond that, I think our attitude should be that of Saint Basil in his Hexameron. The legitimate conclusions of science should be used whenever they help the task of interpreting the sacred text. The science phobia, which has been caused among some Orthodox Christians by the false use of science on the part of anti-Christians, should be overcome. In the case of evolution, I don't see how the question can be discussed at all without a basic knowledge of the scientific proofs for and against. I don't mean we should become passionately attached to them or place them on the same level as theology. We should just be aware of them and know how to assess their relative value. The scientific creationists are very useful in this regard, because they have hunted up evidence which had been selectively disregarded by predisposed evolutionists. For example, the remarkable evidence of an Earth under 10,000 years old, which must definitely be weighed against the evidence for an Earth much older, etc. 3. But is the question of the age of the human race, some 7,000 or 8,000 years versus a million or more years, really theological or important? You doubt whether it is. I offer 2 observations. A. The Holy Fathers, probably unanimously, certainly have no doubt that the chronology of the Old Testament, from Adam onwards, is to be accepted literally. They did not have the fundamentalists' over-concern for chronological precision, but even the most mystical fathers, Saint Isaac the Syrian, Saint Gregory Palamas, etc., were quite certain that Adam lived literally some 900 years, that there were some 5,500 years, more or less, between the creation and the birth of Christ, etc. Footnote. See the quotes of Saint Isaac the Syrian on page 419 above and page 602 below. Saint Isaac writes that, in his time, the 7th century AD, the demons were 6,000 years old, reckoning their age from the creation of the world. Ascetical Homilies, Homily 54, English edition, page 269. Saint Macarius the Great likewise states that, in his time, Satan is already 6,000 years old. 50 Spiritual Homilies, Homily 26, English edition, Classics of Western Spirituality series, page 167. In his letter to the Reverend Nun Xenia, St. Gregory Palamas writes that Adam continued to live after that time, i.e., after his fall, even for 930 years. The Philokalia, Volume 4, page 296. Return to text. Blessed Augustine has a good discussion as to the differences between the Greek and Hebrew chronologies. The 1,000 years more or less didn't bother him any more than it did other fathers. But the assertion that Adam lived 1,000,000 or more years ago, and that thus the Old and New Testament chronology is quite arbitrary or fanciful, could not but have evoked numerous patristic discussions. Can we be so trusting of the conclusions of modern science, especially if we have a basic knowledge of radiometric dating procedures and the philosophy underlying them, as to totally overturn the patristic opinion? Dr. Calamiros and other Orthodox evolutionists say we should, without a second thought. I would say this is dangerous presumption, and an intrusion of dubious science into the realm of revealed truth, when Dr. Calamiros dismisses the patristic interpretation of the Old Testament chronology as Jewish rationalism. I even begin to wonder what his basic attitude to the Fathers is. It seems to have an element of disrespect, to say the least. B. More important, more theological. One's picture of reality, of the world, definitely influences one's view of God. I offer you very briefly 2 pictures, models, of man and his world. 1. Man created some 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, separately from other creatures, not descended from others, dispassionate by nature, in soul and body, with Eve miraculously created from his rib, in a way we cannot describe with scientific precision, as St. John Chrysostom indicates, in a world of creatures with natures basically stable and not in process of becoming other natures. Much could be said on separate details of this picture, and knowledge of many of the details can never be precise. But basically, it does not contradict the text of Genesis and is harmonious with the Orthodox view of God. 2. Man descended from lower creatures, passionate by his origin in nature, becoming dispassionate in paradise, when grace brought him out of his bestial state, according to Calamiros, at a moment very hazy both chronologically and theologically. Today Roman Catholic evolutionists deny paradise altogether because they can't reconcile it with evolutionary philosophy. Existing in his fallen state perhaps 1,000,000 or more years, during which time he gradually came up from savagery to civilization, the record of him in the Old Testament being extremely sketchy and not to be taken seriously when it speaks of years. The world around man being in a constant state of change and ascent from one nature to another, and this whole process being explainable, more or less, by science, except for the original impulse of creation itself, which produced a rather undifferentiated mass with the potentiality of all future developments. Calamiros insists there is nothing miraculous about the 6 days of creation. They all proceeded according to scientific laws. This picture, that of theistic or God-guided evolution, can be reconciled with the text of Genesis and its patristic interpretation only by means of many jumps and improvisations and wholesale disregard of patristic evidence. The chief reason, I suspect, why it does not give the horrors to Orthodox believers in God-guided evolution, as, for example, Father N. professes himself to be, is simply because they put their heads in the sand and don't bother to think about it at all, because of a very unhealthy science phobia. But my point here is not one's view of God basically affected by such a picture of the world? For example, the view of an Orthodox evolutionist like Theodosius Dobzhansky, in his address on receiving an honorary doctorate from St. Vladimir Seminary, utterly denies the providence of God in the world. His God is the deist God. St. John Damascene, following St. Gregory of Nyssa and others, states that it is unworthy of God to believe that he created man's body and soul in separate moments, as if he did not have power for the whole act at once. This act of creation was simultaneous. Here the text of Genesis is not to be interpreted literally or chronologically. Calamiros specifically denies this. His interpretation of St. Seraphim's words would collapse otherwise. How much less worthy of God, then, to believe that he created only some kind of material ocean of potentiality and left everything to evolve by itself, according to natural laws. All this, as you can see, is an informal discussion presented for your reflection. Precise citations will have to be given when I have time. 25. Clergy in Greece against Orthodox evolutionism. To Bishop Gregory, November 22/December 5, 1980. In the 1981 conference in Pennsylvania, I noticed that Dr. Alexander Calamiros will be speaking on the creation of man and the world, and I greatly fear that his talk and his very presence will only promote the spirit of criticism, which is poisoning our church so much. I myself had a lengthy correspondence with Dr. Calamiros some years ago on the subject of creation and evolution, and I discovered to my astonishment that he is an adherent of the most naive kind of evolutionism. He wrote that Adam could well have had the face of an ape, because he was at first an ape-like creature to whom God gave his spirit, and that he is most doctrinaire and arrogant in upholding his opinions. He refused to discuss any scientific evidence with me because I have no doctor's degree in science, and when I criticized some of his opinions and showed that some of his scientific evidence is outdated and is no longer accepted even by evolutionary textbooks in the West, he broke off the correspondence with me. Dr. Calamiros' opinions on creation have been greatly criticized by conservative clergy in Greece, and theologically, in his correspondence with me, he had very shaky and superficial grounds for upholding his scientific evolutionism. In addition, Dr. Calamiros has now made himself notorious in Greece for starting his own schism from the old calendarists over the issue of the icon of the Trinity, showing God the Father as an old man. He insists the icon is heretical and justifies the breaking of communion with those who venerate or even tolerate it. 26. People are ready to hear this, to Father A.Y. Meet Fair Saturday, 1981. Thinking about my Genesis course this summer, I was rereading part of Dr. Calamiros' letters. How discouraging. One loses all inspiration to get tangled up in this subject, seeing how he handles it. And really, the tone is just like Deacon L.S. I wondered why, and Father Herman answered me. They're trying to keep up with the advanced fashions in the universities, and I think that's probably really the answer. Especially Calamiros' repeated insistence, Deacon L. says the same thing, over how many have lost their souls because of literal interpretations of Genesis. That is, we have to give them Genesis on their level. changing the truth if need be, so as not to offend them or give them more than they can chew. But anyone who is really converted to Christianity will surely begin to rethink his whole intellectual outlook, won't he? Isn't the real problem that Dr. Calamiro's Deacon L. and others are intellectuals who haven't been fully converted, or have brought their intellectual baggage with them into orthodoxy, the same thing they accuse others of? This was the disease of the Russian intellectual converts earlier in this century, those Russian emigrants who formed the Parisian school of modernist Orthodox theology, and I think our Greeks fall into the same category. Therefore, I am plowing ahead with Genesis according to the Holy Fathers, realizing that it may cause more waves among the Greeks and name-calling, but I'm already a theosophist and can't get much worse than that, especially since it will be competition to Dr. Calamiro's talk in Pennsylvania. Speaking of Genesis, I see no reason why this course on Genesis couldn't be turned into the main portion of our long-lost evolution book. The whole outline of it now becomes clear to me. It should be called something positive, no evolution in the title, such as Genesis, Creation and Early Man, an Orthodox view, and the first and main part should be simply an Orthodox interpretation, according to St. John Chrysostom, St. Ephraim, etc., of the first chapters of Genesis, discussing problems raised by modern men in the course of the discussion. Then, as the secondary thought, less than half the book, a discussion of the whole question of evolution. If we can carry it through, it should be a pioneering work which will make this question at least discussable among Orthodox Christians, many of whom are concerned but just don't know where to begin to think it through. What do you think? Any ideas or discussions? I will be working on the whole first part for the summer course, and maybe you and I could look over and organize the rest of it sometime this summer. Then it will be timely to print it, especially since the subject will be somewhat in the air with my and Calamiro's talks. Rereading Calamiro's letters, I see that there is something quite basic at stake. It is obvious that Calamiro's has no intention whatever to humble himself before the mind of the Fathers. He knows better than they, and therefore he easily categorizes as absurd opinions which they held because he himself has thought it out better, with the aid of modern science. In this case he is broader than the Fathers. In most cases, perhaps, our Greeks are narrower, but it is their own wisdom that they trust and which they wish to impose on others. Our key is sticking to the wisdom of the Church, trusting our own Fathers and the Holy Fathers who lived before. People are ready to hear this.